Hello, everybody, and welcome for real this time to JHR's Human Rights webinar on protecting journalists from online hate and harassment in Canada. My name is Bill Clorn. I'm the Interim Executive Director of Journalists for Human Rights. And I just want to start by apologizing for the technical difficulties that we were experiencing. But I think we are live now and everyone can hear us. So I will begin with a little introduction before I pass it over to our esteemed panelists and our wonderful moderator. Today's event marks the conclusion of one of the most important projects that JHR has been a part of, and that is one that is tackling online hate and harassment. Unfortunately, hate and harassment online is something we are all familiar with. At times, it just seems to be a natural feature of the internet and something that we have to put up with when we're surfing social media or engaging in online discussions, or in the case of journalists, simply just doing their jobs. What I find truly remarkable about this project in particular is that those who participated rejected that premise that online hate and harassment is inevitable and something that we just have to tolerate. Over the last few months, JHR has hosted a series of roundtables with journalists and experts from across Canada. These journalists discussed difficult experiences, at times very personal experiences, and brought ideas on how to improve things. The results of these sessions were captured in a report that I'm pleased to say JHR is launching today. These sessions were expertly facilitated by Seher Shafiq, who has generously agreed to continue her excellence here today as a moderator for today's event. And before I hand things off to her, I just want to say a few thank yous. First and foremost, we need to thank our financial supporters for this project, the InSpirit Foundation and the Rossi Foundation. JHR can't do the work that we do in Canada and around the world without the generous support of our benefactors, and so we want to first and foremost thank them. I also want to thank all the journalists and contributors to the sessions and to the report. In particular, I want to thank Karina Deegan for her contribution to the report, and of course to Seher for her facilitating of the sessions. Finally, I want to thank JHR's domestic program manager, Sarah Laddick. As I've said before, I really like the opportunity to speak publicly about our staff, to embarrass them and talk about how wonderful they are. And I just want to say firsthand that Sarah really put a lot of herself into this project. And I don't think I have met someone who cares more about the state of Canadian journalism, and in particular, the welfare of Canadian journalists, more than Sarah Laddick. I am honored to work with her, and I am pleased to have her as a part of the JHR team. And on the day when we launch this report, just want to give her the congratulations on taking the lead on this project. So congrats, Sarah, and over to you, Seher.
Thank you, Bill. Sorry again, everyone, for the technical issues. I'm going to do a super quick intro and then put the panelists' full bios with their Twitter pages in the chat to save us some time. So we have three amazing panelists here today who are all involved in the report roundtables that helped to inform the report that was just launched and shared in the chat. First up, we have Julie Sobowale, who is a lawyer and freelance journalist focused on legal affairs, access to justice, and she is a board member at the Canadian Association of Journalists. Going to put her full bio in the chat here. Next, we have Elamin Abdelmahmoud, who is the host of CBC's daily arts, entertainment, and pop culture show Commotion, and the author of #1 best-selling memoir, Son of Elsewhere. He also has a second book coming up, which he says not to ask him about, but we will definitely ask him about it shortly. And last but not least, Saba Eitizaz, who is currently a podcast host and producer for the Toronto Star. She's an award-winning journalist as well for her advocacy, and previously was an international reporter with the BBC, reporting in conflict zones in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And her info is also in the chat, and you can connect with her online there. So I'm gonna bundle up the first two questions into one. So the first question is, you're all very busy people. Why is this topic important to you enough that you participated in these roundtables and showed up today? And then secondly, in the roundtables, we talked a bit about how the nature of hate and harassment has changed recently and why. So where you stand, what is the broader political and social context that we're in right now? What is this moment and how is it changing the nature of hate and harassment? And I'll open the floor to whoever is ready to answer those.
Saba, do you want to start this time? Because you had such a beautiful, perfect answer. I feel like, Saba, you should start.
I think it's only polite that you started first, but okay, you go second. I'll start. I feel like I poured my heart out the first time. I'm sorry for the technical issues that you couldn't hear that, but The reason why I'm here almost feels personal at this point. It's because I have a folder in my phone called Hate, and it has a collection of all the digital harassment I've received over the past few years, which consists of the most vitriolic, misogynistic, Islamophobic, abuse that I have encountered in my career. I think I've lost count of the number of ways that I've been dehumanized. And I know that there are journalists all across Canada with similar folders because we've had to do the job of collecting our own abuse, trying to create a picture and a data framework that didn't exist before. I also want to put the debate to rest because, at this point into what is going on, we're still arguing about what harassment is. We're still talking about there being, trying to tell people that there's a difference between mean tweets on the internet and graphic rape and death threats directed at your being. Ironically, I've also now dealt with systemic harassment in 2 countries. I was the subject of a targeted and organized hate campaign back home in Pakistan as an international journalist as well. It eventually trickled over into real life violence as these things are statistically proven to do so, and I ended up here. So I've seen the chilling effect of this on journalists, on democracy, on societies in 2 countries now, and I'm seeing a lot of this happening and increasing over the past few years in Canada. And I also want to talk about this because nobody talks about the personal toll that this kind of relentless abuse takes on you. We talk about this abuse in terms of waves, right? Like, oh, we get these emails, there's a wave of it, then it dies down. It's not like that. Just because I'm not tweeting about it or I'm not doing a thread about it or I'm not talking about it doesn't mean that the abuse has stopped. We still continue to get incredibly hateful messages, various forms of trolling online, and I could go on. It takes a toll on you. There's a blood tax that we pay for it. It affects your mental health, your physical health, it affects you emotionally. It chips away at your body and your mind and your work till you kind of forget who you are. And it affects your work. Like, even if you don't want to, you find yourself self-censoring. And this is a story that's just not mine. I've heard it across, different newsrooms from different journalists. I'm also here to talk about, some of the problems that the other journalists are facing. A lot of journalists can't come up and talk about this. They're still vulnerable. They are still in perilous work conditions in newsrooms. It is still not really encouraged or permitted in many situations for people to be able to speak about this safely. So I'm here to try and amplify those stories as well.
Julie, do you want to go this time?
Sure, just as someone is trying to call me. Yes, thank you for having me here. And thank you, Saba, for pouring out your heart twice. That was so well said. I'm also here to voice that this behavior is not okay. And Elamin, I know you had said this earlier as well. We really should not be talking about the what anymore. We should be talking about the how. So how do we take collective action to protect journalists? And let's be real specific here. We're talking about female journalists of color, okay, who are usually the main targets. And not to say that others have not been targets of hate and harassment, of course, and that is captured in the report. But really, there is a concerted effort to silence their voices. And this refers to your second question about what's happening right now in the political and social climate. And this goes beyond what's happening in Gaza right now. We can look at the own political conflict that is happening in our own country and across the border and in other democratic countries in terms of a pushback against diversity and inclusion. And so I'm just putting voice to what we all already know. Because as Saba has said, not everyone is able to say this. And so my biggest concern is not only for the journalists who are here now, but also the next generation of journalists. I want young people to see journalism as a viable career, right? This is where people start laughing. But seriously, I do. And if we don't want them to experience what we are experiencing now, we have a duty to protect journalists, especially female journalists of color. And so that was why I wanted to be a part of this report. I also understand we're at an interesting time in our history right now in terms of the number of democratic elections that are happening in key countries around the world and the discourse and misinformation that's happening right now and how that directly affects journalists. And so sorry, I'm coming in hot, but that's how I usually roll. So this is really why I wanted to participate. Thank you so much for having me here.
Julie, I love a sorry, not sorry. You're like, sorry, but that's just who I am as a person. I want to pick up on a couple of things that both of you mentioned. Saba, I wrote down the phrase, I lost count of the ways that I've been dehumanized, because I think that sticks with a person, that sticks with, sticks with you when you hear something like that. And then the idea of collective action, Julie, I think like those are related to my answer to you, Seher. The first answer is it's the thing that Bill mentioned, the idea that some of us have gotten a little too accustomed to the notion that online harassment is just a part of the job. And that's not a part of the job. In no one's job description, when you sign up to be a host, when you sign up to be a reporter, when you sign up to be a producer, an editor, nowhere in the job description does it say, also, by the way, you're gonna have to contend with some of the worst, most vile harassment you've ever encountered. And I'm guilty, I think, of normalizing it. And I'm guilty of saying that's just a part of the job. And it wasn't until getting the invitation to be a part of the roundtables and have those conversations that I started hearing from other people who were trying to say, it's really odd and really horrific that we've all gotten sort of a chance to get used to this, but maybe this can stop now. Maybe, and if it was going to stop now, how does it stop now? That was point number one. Number two, I think, like, to the point of this particular climate in this particular moment, I'll just say this. I'll say that newsrooms have had a number of years, more than 5 years, of making it a part of their project to say, hey, journalists of color, particularly women, bring your identities to work. We want more of your identities in the work that we produce because we find that it is resonating with audiences. It is baked into the business model. It is baked into the people that they're trying to speak to. However, they, and by they, I mean employers of all shades and colors, are unwilling to contend with the costs of that, because the costs of that for people who have to put up with harassment because of their identities that they brought to work because their employer asked them to, that exposes them to more and more harassment. And so there's kind of like some employers, I would say, would really like the fruits, would not really like the labor of what it means to protect those journalists if you're going to be asking them to bring those identities to work with them and use the lens and use the personal experiences that shape their lives in order to get closer to covering stories that otherwise these newsrooms would not be able to even, get close to at all. And so there's a mismatch there. And I think like this report and this conversation is a starting place in terms of just naming some of these dynamics that have been at work for some time.
Thanks to all three of you for being so honest and candid and authentic. I think one thing that was amazing about the roundtables, which were closed door, is the level of like realness that came through. And so, Julie, if you're coming in hot, like that's what we want to hear. Keep in mind it's publicly broadcasted, so it's not closed door, but like we want to hear your real experiences and your real thoughts about what solutions are. So let's talk a little bit about some of the specifics and solutions. My next question was, how do you think marginalized groups experience this issue differently? And Julie, you talked a little bit about that already. I wanted to open the floor and ask about, just hear a bit more about that. And also, given different demographics experience hate and harassment online differently, how should supports change accordingly, given how that is?
Yeah, I mean, Julie's kind of summed up a lot of, and, I've talked a little bit about how, we're still debating on the tweets, or whether they're mean tweets or mean comments, but the nature of them changes extremely sinisterly when you're talking about people of color, when you're talking about women. They've experienced some of the worst possible abuse and harassment. I don't think that, you sign up for a job where you're being told in very graphic description and detail how you're going to be summarily executed by an AR-15 shot to the back of your head, or to be told that, to be, given strange references about my country, about how I deserve to die by being stoned to death, strange Taliban Taliban references. And one of the burdens I can speak for myself and, a few others who've gone through this, one of the burdens has been to explain that context to somebody, at a senior level in management, or to journalist leadership, like everywhere, not just our newsroom, about why it's so subversive, when somebody's talking about a summary execution, Taliban style. I come from a country that had real threats around that, and I've dealt with that. Or if somebody is making a specific cultural reference that's extremely dehumanizing and offensive to me, half of my burden was trying to explain this context to somebody, checking in on it. So I feel like we need a better understanding and a more trauma-informed approach in terms of how management or how newsrooms can look into this. And also we need better representation at like top levels. Like every year the CAJ does these surveys, and we talk about how many Black women are in leadership, how many women of color, people of color are in leadership positions. It doesn't even make double numbers. It makes a difference to have people who look like you, speak like you, who understand the lived experience that you're coming from, and therefore the context and the color of the abuse that you're receiving. It takes a lot of the burden and a lot of the unpaid labor off of us to have to explain those contexts. It's also very intersectional. The abuse that, people of color are already underrepresented in this industry. They're dealing with a number of other systemic issues that, are intersectional, cost of living. They're not often in the highest positions. And on top of that, they're dealing with the additional tax of the mental and emotional tax of dealing with this abuse, of having to justify it to people, of having to curate and monitor themselves on their social media and then become their own advocates. It's a lot of free labor. If you ask me, I think that newsrooms need to start thinking about that, and newsrooms need to start thinking about the systemic issues around the abuse, not just in the moment, like, case by case, let's deal with this, let's do a check-in and it's over. Look at all of the other issues that are creating that abuse, which also includes platforming the kind of content or the kind of things that could create, dangerous ideas about marginalized groups. We are still at a point where there are our colleagues in the industry, where there are news platforms that are downplaying the serious nature of the abuse that journalists are receiving. They're downplaying the fact that there is extreme polarization happening in the country, that there are far-right issues that are expanding. So I feel like, when we started this, we started talking about it a couple of years back. We tried to start a national conversation. A letter was written to political stakeholders, to security stakeholders, signed by 48 plus news organizations. And I felt that now, 2 years later, the needle would be budging on it, right? But I feel like we're going 2 steps back. And to Julie's point, there are, currently journalists who are facing extreme Islamophobia and anti-Semitism for covering Gaza. We are dealing with situations where a colleague of mine had a paid ad campaign against him, like on Twitter. We are in a difficult time, and I'm feeling a reversal of all the things that we talked about. And it seems like, it's like, oh, it happened 2 years ago, it's died down, and now we're just like having a whole new conversation all over again. So it really feels like all of that, to me, for now, it feels like the hard work hasn't really gone anywhere.
I feel like there's also there's an element of translation in terms of the harassment and abuse and hate against a lot of journalists that maybe doesn't quite translate for managers, it just sort of doesn't translate up the chain. I think, like, if you've been a reporter and then you become somewhere in management, then you maybe understand a lot of the harassment as like someone is disagreeing with you. Well, they're not quite doing that, right? Like they're doing that, but they're using all the tools available to them of racism, misogyny, of sexism, in order to sort of up the ante of the way that they're expressing their disapproval of your work, and disapproval of your presence, simply because they can, simply because they can use those tools. And so a journalist in management, particularly a white journalist in management, might sort of understand disagreement in an entirely different way and say, like, well, aren't we used to getting reader pushback? It's not quite that, right? Like you're getting exposed to a level of vitriol that, if he was coming to you in the workplace, you would immediately understand that this is a thing you have to shut down. But because it's coming online, it feels more diffuse, but guess what? It's not more diffuse to the journalists who have to deal with this. And so there's a level of which, managers sort of tend to treat this crisis the same way they treat all other responses to, a disagreement, for example. They just say, hey, you note it and you move on. You can't quite do that, especially if somebody's kind of lobbing some of these things at you, at your identity. It wounds you in a different way that I just don't know if managers always appreciate, in a sense.
If I could just quickly add to that, I think it's also a level of believability and a certain set of privilege that comes with being a white colleague or a white senior management to not, it's always like you are trying to explain the context, the nuance of the hatred that you're getting, the racialized aspect of it, and the misogynistic aspect of it. So I feel like there's a certain privilege. I think our white colleagues, I think some of our male colleagues have never experienced this kind of hate and vitriol. They've never experienced, what it feels like to be given a graphic rape threat or to be told how you're going to be beaten up and in what way for doing your job. So I think there's a level of privilege to that. I think that our other white colleagues don't experience, and the abuse is not just coming in from those traditional, platforms. Like, I think there are white colleagues in our industry that need to show allyship in stronger ways, which does require less silence, and it also requires care and consideration when you're putting information out there or you're tweeting about something. It both thinking, are you causing harm by that? There's a new form of harassment that's now like it's dogpiling or dog whistling, where some senior columnists have made some problematic tweets on social media about journalists of color, women journalists of color, and it's incited a lot of people and encouraged a lot of people to throng onto that journalist's account and then further harass them. So allyship doesn't just like end in the newsroom, like we're all your colleagues in the industry. And I think we need to think about these other things, which are like it's a wider conversation about privilege, right? And who experiences what and what language.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just add one extra thing to this. The lack of understanding, the lack of education, sometimes the lack of like not wanting to know either. So I'll be really clear about this. Intimate partner violence, right? There are so many intricacies about intimate partner violence. You really need to work to understand it unless you have lived it. I feel the same way with this, because I think in newsrooms, some newsroom managers see that and see, well, that person's not really going to do that. Is that person really going to do? And there is actual evidence that, yes, that person will do that. I know in my time serving as an executive member for the Canadian Association of Black Journalists, yes, people will act out violently. And so if you have not lived that, you actually need to be willing to step into that. And the work that we've done at the CAJ with the diversity survey, we see some pushback on, yes, we know we need to do this. There's a level of vulnerability. There's a level of humility. Maybe we actually don't know. And maybe we actually need to do things differently, right? Maybe we need to unpack how we do journalism and what reader feedback is. And there's not enough time to really go through all of this today, but it is in the report, and we discussed this in our closed door meetings, that really actually gave me a lot of fire under my belly, that we're actually having open discussions about this. I think it's about the actual interaction and work we do in the newsroom. We can't tolerate this behavior, but we have to understand not only how it affects people, but how it affects journalism itself and organizations itself. It's much more than just, sorry, Elamin, go ahead.
Well, no, I was just really liking that point and really appreciating it, because I think you have to know what you don't know. And that's something that this industry doesn't talk about enough. I think that one of the things that the report highlights is that there are massive rooms when it comes to digital safety, which is to say, when one of your journalists comes to you and says, hey, I am receiving all this harassment, who are the people who are trained, who know the tools of digital safety, who can come to you and say, okay, this is the next thing that you know. So why are there still huge gaps in newsrooms when it comes to digital safety, and who is going to formalize the filling of those gaps so that every manager is sort of equipped to tackle some of these things, because it is a workplace issue and has to kind of be treated like one. And in order for it to become treated like one, you have to formalize and like establish a formal process in which go like, there's a digital safety issue and here's how we're going to fix it. A good example of this is like, maybe about a year and a half ago, I was subject to a digital harassment campaign that is like, I don't want to normalize it. It just happens like clockwork every once in a while. But one of the suggestions that I got was like, hey, why don't you like mute the tweets? Muting the tweets means I can't assess whether the threat is escalating or not, right? Like that's not necessarily an option. If I mute the tweets, is somebody else going to monitor them? Is there a department that's going to do that? Is there an individual person who's tasked with doing this? There has to be some kind of specifically involved organizational, reorganization that says this is a part of the organization that's going to handle the best practices of digital safety and how we're going to enact them, as opposed to sort of dealing with it on a case-by-case basis. And that sort of just goes to your point, Julie, when it comes to the idea that we're just like not equipped. We continue to not know what we don't know. And sometimes I feel like and by we, I mean like newsrooms, are like a little incurious. They're not interested, in dedicating a lot of resources to filling that knowledge gap. And so I'm really hopeful that this report will be the beginning of that process.
So we all in different shapes and forms brought up, this wasn't part of the job. I wasn't expecting this. There's an accountability on management and workplaces. Julie, in our final roundtable, you brought up a really interesting perspective from your legal background about legal workplace rights and hate and harassment online, and that resonated with everybody on the roundtable. Can you talk a little bit more about the way that you see workplace obligations to this issue?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've all touched upon this. Employers have the responsibility to create a safe working environment. That's just full stop. So if you have an employee who is experiencing hate and harassment, you have a responsibility to do something about it. This might sound so basic, but I have heard terrible stories from journalists who were told to ignore it altogether. And that is not only is that morally wrong, legally, you're not allowed to do that. You are opening yourself up to that person filing a human rights violation or workplace safety. Provincial legislation also covers this. For example, CBC, of course, is federally legislated. They are federally mandated to have a safe working environment, which is why I think CBC is ahead in terms of others. But to me, there's no gray line here. And one of the best ways we see that is with unions, right? Unions have really done a lot of work. I love unions. I could talk about unions all day, but basically they've done a lot to make sure that journalists have a safe working environment. And I do know indirectly unions who are thinking about this, and we need unions to think about this at a broader systemic level. This systemic hate and harassment campaign against journalists online, and we need to update our collective bargaining agreements so that management has to deal with the legal obligations they already have. Every province has workplace safety legislation. Federally, there's workplace safety legislation. This isn't something new. What is new, I guess, for newsrooms is actually thinking about this in that kind of way. But when you talk to a union, they know for sure that that legislation exists. So that's the perspective that I've been looking at this. This is what I've been fighting for years. Saba mentioned the letter and the discussions at the government level. I was a part of that as well a few years ago. There's some serious legislative reform that we need as well. But every employer has a responsibility. Whether you employ 2 journalists or 200, you have to create a safe working environment.
Thanks, Julie. And that falls really well into the next question, which is towards Saba about newsroom management. So Saba, you've worked in a lot of institutional newsrooms on various continents over the years. What do you wish management did more of, and what do you wish management did less of when it comes to online hate and harassment of journalists?
Right. I mean, I think it's really, progress that we've moved away from the, journalists need to have a thick skin narrative a little bit. So I consider, small steps. So we are going forward. And also to Elamin's earlier points about, he was talking a little bit to the newsrooms needing to have a sustainable sort of protective structure and a department. I think some of that work was done like a couple of years back in terms of when this became a bit of a national conversation, when that letter went out. I believe the CBC and the Toronto Star, they're trying to create systems where they can provide some kind of buffer zone or some kind of protocol. It feels like it's not accessible to everybody. It feels like, it's kind of easier for, everyone to see the more, let's say, visible journalists or the more vocal journalists, but they're vulnerable journalists who are not able to get that same access or don't feel safe in their employment to be able to, to talk about this stuff or to get the help that they need. So I think that more needs to be built on that framework. I think management, like I said earlier, needs to move beyond just a seasonal approach to this, or, we did a check-in, we built, we got through it, and now we're going to start from scratch when the next time it happens. The Toronto Star has managed to create, I think it's a good idea. You talk about, there are a lot of newsrooms that say we're just going to mute all of the emails. We're going to filter all of the emails. And to Elamin's point, we don't want that, because if you're getting death threats, if you're getting, horrible stuff, like somebody like me who's very vigilant, who's been through safety issues before, I would rather know rather than, and it gives me some sort of sort of agency over the situation. But what the Toronto Star has done is that they have created a sort of buffer zone where the hate mail doesn't directly get to me. So it's not like a sudden shock. So it reaches, their filters, and it gets to some editors. It's sent there first. And then they get in touch with me and they say, we received something, to mentally prepare me and to be a sort of buffer, and then ask me if I want to see it, and then it proceeds from there. So buffer zones like those are really important. I think it's really important to have trauma-informed approaches, victim-based approaches, and to understand who you're talking to. If you're hiring diverse staff, they cannot check their identities at the door. They will be bringing those with them. I also find it particularly unhelpful. There is a certain discourse which it feels almost gaslighty to me, because it kind of places the blame of our online or social media presence on the kind of vitriol that we receive. So you'll hear people say like, oh, well, then go offline, or don't go on Twitter so much. And to me, that this is an issue of shrinking spaces. Like, if the digital infosphere is our new public square, it's like telling women or vulnerable people, oh, don't go out in the park because you'll get harassed, so just stay inside. So to me, it's about shrinking spaces. I'm not willing to give an inch of my space that I've earned with hard work. And so I don't think it's helpful to have that kind of dialogue, or to curate people's social medias, or to tell them to stay off of it, because that's not going to end hate and harassment. As we've seen, it travels from different platforms, and it can happen also in real life. So these are some of the things. And there's also a conversation about how, like, we're talking about big newsrooms. So we say, big newsrooms have a lot of resources, they have more power and more sort of ideas on how to deal with this, and we kind of leave out smaller newsrooms or freelancers who might not get access to the same, and we say it's because there's lesser resources. But it doesn't have to be a lot, for example, at the BBC, we had something called a TRIM protocol, which was a peer-to-peer kind of trauma-informed approach. So you trained people, your colleagues, like other people in the newsroom, to be able to assess, your other colleague, for instance, who's had dealt with a difficult story or has dealt with abuse or harassment. And then the peer can just kind of give that initial assessment of like how they're doing, and then it moves on up the chain, and then the newsroom can provide the help that journalist needs. So it doesn't take a lot. It just requires like a sort of political will, and it requires like little ways to check in with your journalists and to understand that the harassment just doesn't end when the emails stop coming. It has an effect on the work. It has an effect, like, this is stuff that needs to be thought about at performance evaluations, for instance, right? These are things that leave scars. And that's something that needs to be considered as well. So those are some of the important things. And I've been talking about representation. We really, really need representation of people of color, racialized people at executive and leadership levels to be able to understand a lot of what I'm saying.
Thanks, Saba. So next question to Elamin, and then after that, we'll wrap up with one last question for the whole panel. So Elamin, during our roundtables, we did one specifically on the mental health toll of online hate and harassment, and your next book is about the impact of constantly being online, and it connects with some of the issues that we've been talking about today. Can you tell us more about what drove you to write an entire book on that topic, and also how your thinking has emerged as the nature of online hate has changed?
Can't believe you're asking about my next book. Unbelievable, but also thank you for the question. Okay, so the book really came out of just like this constant feeling that the internet is asking us regularly to put more and more of ourselves online. The sort of the story of the internet, at least for the past like 15 or so years, has been like, there's not enough of you online, you need more. There's not enough of you online, you need more. You need to sort of figure out how to represent and recreate your digital self, right? Like yourself, but digitally. And as we do more and more of that, as we invest more time into constructing, you know, a presence on Twitter or Instagram, or just a general story of who you are online, what that does is also like it opens you up to people who will respond to that very specific story in sometimes ways that are really unwelcome, some ways that, you know, you didn't necessarily ask for. That the book in general is dealing with a lot of these themes, the themes of, you know, how does one create themselves online in a way that is actually like, you know, how do you feel in accordance with the two, how do you sort of harmonize the two selves, because your digital self is not your real life self. But as I write more and more about this, I sort of like start to think about that actually, like it takes something out of you to sort of perform for a digital self, but perform for a digital audience constantly. And sometimes when you do this work for a living, even as it's extracting this cost out of you to perform this digital self, it also comes at the additional cost of some harassment from some folks. And so you sort of have to figure out where to put distance between who you are and the self that you sort of presented online. I think like that's well and good to do on an individual basis. It's hard to do on a systemic basis when more and more of all of us are putting ourselves online. And so I've appreciated the conversations that we've been having here. I've appreciated the ways that we've been able to name the dynamics that are happening, the cost that is extracted on everybody. One thing that like I really connected with out of the roundtables was people who were talking about how it's just useful to be able to just sit down with another person who's going through the same thing and go, this happened, you know? And it's something that is like not quite a formalized complaint, you know, process. It's just more so you don't have to go through this experience alone, because the online self can be so atomized from other people, even though like so many of us are sharing the same kinds of harassment, the same kinds of experiences all the time. I was like really encouraged by the fact that other people said, no, I want some solidarity that doesn't necessarily look like solving the problem, because you can't always do that, but it's being seen as going through this thing. And sometimes that involves, you know, like paid work time that is just time for people to just decompress and say, this happened to me online today. I think having to contend with all of it on your own, having to assess all these threats and whether they're real or not on your own, having to sort of read all this content and go like, how hateful is this person willing to get on your own? That's the thing that takes its cost on you. That's the thing that sort of costs you time and energy and space and your own mental health. And so the answer to all of this is sort of community. The internet has kind of like set us up to experience so much of the digital world as individual people surfing it, but also that's not the way that we structure any of our lives, you know, whether it's doing journalism work or doing community activism. There's a togetherness that you don't quite get in the online world. And I was really encouraged by the fact that the roundtables brought up the fact that like this atomization is a thing that is not good for us. How do we sort of break out of that?
Thank you, Elamin. if there's any information about that, feel free to pop it in the chat for people to read more about your book. I mean, I think you really didn't want to talk about. So we're almost at the end of our time, but I do want to ask you all one last question. So you are all clearly very smart, extremely talented people. There are so many things you could do with your time and with your life, but you're in this industry when it's hard. Like, I don't think anyone will deny that it's really hard to be in this industry right now. What drives you to stay and to keep doing this work when it is so hard?
I think it's just, like you said it yourself, and we all know it's not a job that pays exceptionally well. It also costs us way much more. We put a lot more into it than we get back from it. I think just the, despite all of that, there's a lot of us who are very passionate about doing what we do, is because the act of journalism, or the job of journalism itself, is like, it's an act of hope, right? It's an act of belief that things will change, that it is important to tell the stories of the communities and the perspectives that we bring to the table in this industry, and that if we keep doing that, it will have an impact and it will change things at a systemic level. It's an idealistic job. You need to have that. You need to have that belief that, by doing this, you're doing something, you're making change. And there can be small conversations, and there can be reports like, that came out of those small conversations, like right now. But I think that's part of the work. The work is the belief and the fact that you're making a difference in the world, and that the stories that you're amplifying and your own lived experience that you're bringing to it is important for the world.
Yeah, listen, I think this job is a romantic job. I don't think anyone does this work if they're not at heart. Even I know that the trope of journalists is to sort of be like hardened and cynical, and I don't buy it. I think you would go do something else if you were that. You know what I mean? I think there at the core of this job, there is a romance, and there's an optimism, and there's hope. And the hope stems from maybe some of the moments that we've encountered before in our lives, where you went for a real long time reading the news, and the news became this like sort of separate otherworldly construct, and you don't really like know how to relate to it. And then you read that one story that sort of lays bare the structures that you think about all the time. You're like, I've never thought of it this way until this one story sort of broke open the ways I need to understand it. The at its core, this job is a romance. There's a romantic pursuit of an idea of truth. There's a romantic pursuit of being able to unlock the sequence of words and the sequence of images and the sequence of sounds that make somebody go, I get the world a little more than I did yesterday. That doesn't go away, regardless. It turns out to be quite a resilient drive. It doesn't go away in the face of a lot of harassment and a lot of reasons to, I don't know, go work at Google. You know what I mean? There's something about the resilience of the drive of being able to, today we'll do it. Today we'll find that one person who listens to the story and goes, yeah, I got it. I got what this is, and now I know how to behave in the world in a different way than I did yesterday. Maybe it doesn't drive them to do that, but I don't think that romance ever really goes away. So I wish I could give you a practical answer, but I've never met somebody coming out of journalism school who's been like, I'm really doing this for the money. That's not a part of the conversation that is coming up. More often than not, you see people in their idealism, and I think it's beautiful. I'm very weary of cynics. I don't believe you. I'm not buying it. Tell it to somebody who buys it, because it's not me. I think we're a hopeful bunch. That's me. What about you, Julie?
Oh, totally. We're all a hopeful bunch. I did so many people. Oh, Julie, that's why you're a lawyer and a journalist. I'm like, really? That is not it. Because journalism came first. because I'm so hopeful. There's so much hope in journalism. That feeling when you speak with someone and they say thank you for taking the time, not only to listen, but to document my story. Are you kidding me? I've tried to leave journalism so many times, and yet so many people come back to me. By the way, I'm a tech reporter, guys, so it's not even, but I'm speaking to people who usually wouldn't be spoken to, right? And you just can't get away from that. The final thing I'll leave with you folks is a mentor of mine very early in my career said, Julie, keep a folder of your achievements. And that folder is going to be all the kind comments that you receive from anyone about your journalism. And that is the folder I have on this laptop, and it's still going. And so when I am feeling down or when I am also a target, I go back to that folder and I remind myself, this is why I'm still here.
Wow. That was beautiful. That was so beautiful. Thank you so much. That was just a perfect ending to this conversation. We are unfortunately out of time for questions, and it turns out there aren't too many anyways. So I would say feel free to connect with us after the webinar, and I will pass it over to Bill to close us out with the remaining few minutes that we have.
Yeah, certainly a tough act to follow after, I think, some beautiful closing remarks from all of our panelists. I just want to say thank you to Seher for hosting our webinar today. I want to say thank you to Saba, Elamin, and Julie for your very thoughtful, very open, honest, at times very personal discussion today. I think this, the sessions that we had for this project were closed doors, and I think they needed to be to really get into it. But I'm really happy that we had a session at the end where we publicly addressed a lot of the issues that came up and a lot of the issues that are covered, because these are things that people need to hear. These are issues that people need to hear. And I think the panelists' personal takes and points that you made are really poignant and things that I personally hadn't heard before, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners today hadn't heard before. So I want to thank you for that, and I want to remind those who are viewing this that there is a report that kind of takes all of what we heard in the sessions and puts it on paper for everyone to read. It's available on our website. I think someone just posted a link to it. It's on it'll be blasted out through all of our social channels. I would really encourage you, if you liked what you heard today, you want to learn more, take a look at that report. It's very succinct and it's very good, and JHR is very proud of it. I also want to kind of also recognize that we know that there's a lot more work to do on this. This is the beginning, but maybe to borrow Elamin's phrase of a romantic idea, at JHR, we have a romantic idea that the world is what we make it, and change only happens if people step up and create it. And I thank everyone who participated in this process and our panelists today for really putting it on the line and putting out what needs to be changed and how we could get there. And JHR will be there. This is the first step of many steps, and JHR will continue to support journalists in Canada and internationally on this and many other issues. So again, if you're interested in the report, please check it out. If you're interested in JHR, please visit our website. And of course, I always have to mention we are a nonprofit organization that runs on donations. So if you would like to support the work that we do, I believe that the donation link is up there right now. I would encourage you to do so. And once again, thank you to everyone for your participation today.